This would be a bit of a free-flowing conversation, a little about the Congo and Anjan's sort of reporting journey, but also a little about his process of reporting, maybe both our stories and the backgrounds that we come from into reporting for the Western media, about the changing nature of journalism, uh, and the challenges of journalism. So we'll have a lot to cover. But I want to put out a disclaimer for Anjan before we start. His mother is in the audience, so he will be instantly fact-checked, if anything. So I can take more liberties. He can't. So just putting it out there. Um, Before we get to the specific topics, Anjan, you had a non-conventional path to journalism. Can you tell us about how you landed and what things you tried before you decided on journalism?
Sure. I'll be brief, but I think the salient points are. So I grew up in Dubai. I went to Rishi Valley, a boarding school in Andhra Pradesh, and after that I studied for IIT, the JEE exam, the big entrance exam. I got in. I was 1 year at IIT Madras studying engineering. And then I left. I didn't like it, so I left and I went to the US, to Yale. I tried everything. I tried photography, I tried writing, I tried psychology, I tried everything, and ended up studying mathematics, pure mathematics, so abstract algebra. And and then I left that also and bought a one-way ticket to Kinshasa, Congo. And that's how I'd never written a journalistic piece in my life. I sort of showed up just with this idea that I could become a journalist. And so that's how I began.
And when you bought that one-way ticket to Kinshasa, how did your mother feel about it?
She was very encouraging. She was like, "Jao beta, you should go
Okay.
and make it now." No. my mom, my mom, at one point cried because she felt. So I studied mathematics. I had this job at Goldman Sachs as a mathematician, and my mom thought she'd made it. You know, my son, he's done it. I've done a great job, and I don't need to worry about this guy anymore. And wrong. And so wrong answer, and so I went to Congo, and she thought, she said to me, "What have I done wrong? What did I do wrong?"
That you're changing from a stable job to. So my path was slightly different, where I didn't have anything that I knew I was doing. I was a history student, and then history doesn't really lead you to a clear job. So I tried journalism, and I was like, maybe this can pay for my bills, and I stuck with it. While SU had a well-paying job, Goldman Sachs and all. So what was it? What was the driving factor to want to leave all of that behind? What did you want it to do with reporting, with storytelling from these places?
So I think the answer back then is very different from the answer now, looking back, 20 years ago. But back then, mathematics has become a field that's sort of built on abstraction. The whole point is to keep abstracting one layer from the next, and I think you see it in technology today. I think looking back now, I see that technology today wants to abstract nature and the world into equations, wants to abstract our own mental processes into equations, and I think wants to abstract us out of our bodies. And I think this is the interesting thing about AI and artificial general intelligence. I think they are trying to literally abstract our consciousness and put it up in some cloud, and so our bodies become redundant. We don't need our bodies. And I think I sensed that 20 years ago. I wondered, why am I studying these abstractions? They don't make any sense. They don't have any relationship with the material world, with people in these wars, with our bodies. It just doesn't make any sense. Why am I doing this? So I just wanted to get away to something that felt real. And I don't know, in an extreme way, Congo felt like that place, you know, a place where 5 million, back then 4 million people had died in this war. It wasn't on the front pages. I wondered why. Why is this war not reported? Um, why does nobody really care? And that's still the case today, right? Wars like Ukraine or Gaza, not that they're not important, but the Congo war has run for so long, it still doesn't make the front pages. So why? All these questions kind of were in my mind. I wanted to answer them, and I thought the best way was to go there. And I still do that today. You know, I'm now in Mexico. I wanted, the question that drove me to Mexico was, where are we heading as a society with nature? What's our relationship to nature? And 4 years ago, I read that Mexico was the deadliest country for environmental defenders. So I thought, okay, I'll go there and I'll put myself there and I'll learn from them. So similar to, you know, what had driven me to Congo, I'll learn from them. You know, why do these wars matter? Why should they be reported on? What's wrong with the news? Why doesn't the news report on these places more consistently? So yeah, I think that's been kind of a journey through my last 20 years.
Okay. And from the realization that you wanted to do something different, right? To practice. Um, one is that you decide this is the place I'm going to go to. At that time, I'm sure there were many conflicts still playing out around the world. Um, what were the specific reasons for going to the Congo? Secondly, in terms of preparing to go to this place, what were sort of the skill sets or the process of getting yourself sort of confident enough that I'm going to land in this place that I've never been to, I assume, right? And I have made a shift from what I have tried in my life, and I want to do it right, but at the same time, I want to prove to myself that this shift was justified. How did you prepare for that, and what skills did you go with?
So to answer the first question, you know, I'm always looking for a situation that's interesting. So the Congo War, you know, environmental defenders in Mexico, it's all interesting. But the key that makes me take that leap is community. So how can I find a connection to that place? How can I find a personal connection? Someone who will take me in. And so for Congo, it was, I was paying my final bill at Yale. And the cashier was African. I could hear in her accent. So I asked her where she's from. She said Congo, Zaire, the old name for Congo. And I said, oh, I might go there. And she said, you stupid Yale kids, you have no idea what you're doing. You can't even sign your checks, right? I could steal all your money. And she's like, no, you're not going there. You're going to get raped or killed. Like, and so I asked if she could help me, and she was like, no. And then she had a second job at a parking lot in New Haven. And so I would go there each night. I would buy her milkshakes from Dunkin' Donuts, and I'd hang out with her until she said, okay, you can stay with my family. And then when she said that, I was like, that's it, I'm going. Because I know a family's going to take care of me. A family's going to show me what society looks like from the inside. I'm not going to stay in a hotel. So I was like, that's it. You know, that's my entry.
And that sort of bribing people with milkshakes was a skill that carried over from Goldman Sachs, or that was unrelated to? Okay.
Exactly. That's what traders do.
That's what traders do. Okay. And then, in terms of language, was that something you had before you land there?
So I guess I'm good at learning languages by speaking. I'd learned French for a year. I'd studied in France for a year, but my French was still horrible. I showed up in Congo. There was bird flu, I remember. And so I went to interview the Minister of Health. And after 5 minutes, he threw me out. He said, go learn French and stop wasting my time. Come back when you speak better French. So yeah, it was like, you know, listening to the radio every morning, noting down words that I didn't know, looking them up in the dictionary, and just learning the language on the fly, because I wanted to understand what people were saying. And the same thing in Mexico. I showed up, I remember like a month in, I woke up one morning, a message on my phone in Spanish, and I thought, oh no, like I don't understand this. There's culture shock, I'm tired, I'm tired of not understanding, and it took me like a year and a half before I was able to be somewhat fluent. But it's not so hard once you learn French to learn Spanish. So, yeah.
So Anjan mostly writes longer form stories, books, magazine writing. You take your time with a story. How early into your journalism career did you decide that? Because initially you did the regular news stuff, you know, for the Wires, for the New York Times, for others. How early into it did you decide that what I want to do is actually spend time with a subject? I don't want to do the day-to-day of news.
It's actually, I guess, one of the people who was important in my journey was actually your predecessor, Jeffrey Gettleman, who was the New York Times East Africa correspondent at the time. And yeah, I went to Congo. I'd read Bruce Chatwin. I'd read Kapuscinski. I was kind of inspired, but I didn't know if I could do it. And I was leaving Congo to come here, actually. I wrote the first draft of Stringer here, not far from here in Kananur. And the first airport I flew to was here. And on my way here, I passed through Nairobi, and I met Jeffrey. And I said to him, you know what, I have this idea for a book about Congo that's a series of portraits of all the crazy characters I met in Congo. And he said, wow, that sounds great. Wouldn't it be more powerful if you managed to connect them, all these characters, through a story? And I listened to him and I thought, shit, he's right. And this is going to take a lot of work. And I have no idea how I'm going to do it. But that's what I spent like 2 months here, drafting the first draft, and yeah, connecting all those characters through me. You know, that was the only thread. So I thought that's the way I'm going to do it. And it took me 4 years. So it took me a long time. But, you know, his question was the right one. How can you connect all these experiences, all these people into a narrative that, you know, hangs on a thread, hangs on a narrative thread? So that's when I learned narrative and story.
Because this sort of how much we put ourselves as reporters in the story, the first person perspective is a hotly debated issue, whether we keep a distance or it is our eyes that we sort of guide people through a place. I'm sure you wrestle with that do I want to write everything as I in the first person going through? How did you get over that kind of discomfort that comes up for a lot of people?
Yeah, it's super hard. I mean, the first drafts I was questioning myself. We're not trained as journalists to put ourselves in the story. But now it's become my thing. I have 3 books. All of them are memoirs of journalism. So all of them have a political story, a global story, but they also have a personal story. And I find there's so many positives or so many advantages to doing that. I'm trying to think now, like all the reasons. You know, one of the main reasons is when I read a good piece of reporting or I watch a good documentary, I'm always wondering, I'm left wondering often, why is this filmmaker obsessed with this story? I can feel it in a good documentary or piece of reporting. They're obsessed. And I wonder, like, you know, why? Did they lose somebody? Did they love somebody? What happened in their life that made them, you know, obsessed with the story? And you don't get that answer. And so I feel in my own writing, I find it more transparent in a way. I want to tell readers, hey, this is what happened to me. This is why I think I care about Congo, Mexico, Rwanda, whatever it is. And what I offer to the readers, again, a second reason to write, you know, from the first person is I like to write in a way that I'm often writing about marginal stories, marginal places on the so-called peripheries of the world, places people aren't so interested in. So how can I make them interested? I don't want to start the book telling them, oh, I spent 2 years in Congo, 5 years in Rwanda, whatever, 5 years in Mexico. Here's the truth. I'd rather tell them, I didn't know anything about this country. I'd rather start at the place of ignorance, where I didn't know anything. This is what got me interested. I showed up not knowing much, you know, to question about preparation. I'd read a few things I didn't know, but I had an instinct that I was interested, and here's why. And if you're interested for the same reasons, you can sit on my shoulder and we can learn together. And so that's kind of the narrative, how I write these narratives. And I find that more engaging for myself and for the reader. And the third reason, I guess, is I've realized over time that writing about myself as a character helps me process all the crazy things that I see, all these conflicts. It's kind of therapy.
And who, because then we run the risk of over self-indulging sometimes. Who becomes the check that that doesn't happen? That this is essentially a vehicle through which we want to tell a story rather than telling everything about ourselves to the world. Is that something you're good at, discipline yourself, or is it the editors who come into that to make sure that self-indulging doesn't happen too much?
I don't know. I guess the reader has to judge, right? I think they're the ultimate judges. It's always a risk. You know, I think Kapuscinski, Naipaul were reporters who put themselves in the story, but they hardly did. And they don't talk about their marriage or their divorce or their affairs or, you know, Kapuscinski was apparently a spy. So they didn't tell us about any of that. So I pushed the limits, and in pushing the limits, or Bruce Chatwin, you know, in pushing the limits, I'm gonna make mistakes. And yeah, I rely on good editors to tell me you're going too far, this is TMI, too much information, we don't need to know all this stuff. But I think the story is more compelling if I can convey how it's transformed me. And so there has to be some of that in the story. I don't know. There's always a risk.
From sort of the backgrounds of getting to journalism, if we go to sort of the structures that we're writing into, we come from sort of the non-traditional backgrounds that usually associated with, say, the Western press, or even book writing that is published in that part of the world. Yes, your book is just translated into Tamil, you said. So congratulations on that. And hopefully maybe in Malayalam someday. I did hear something really interesting last night where they were like, there are a lot of writers whose books are published and translated into Malayalam without them knowing about it. So there might be a Malayalam translation of your book out there that you don't know about. So if we go into, yes, you wanted to bring these marginalized stories, as you told me, into the mainstream.
Yeah.
How is your experience of doing that? Because yes, background is different, perspective is different. You are choosing stories that you think are not getting enough time. But that process of negotiating space for those stories in the mainstream platforms, how has that been in your experience?
I guess we both share that, right? You're from Afghanistan, I'm from India. We're both reporting, at least so far, both of us have reported on the Global South, so we have to negotiate with the powers that be. And the media, the mainstream media now is still Western dominated. And so I hope that won't be the case through the rest of my career. And I think, I hope that's not the case because, big hope of mine is now countries like India or Kenya or Nigeria are becoming wealthier. There's money. And so the media over here has money, Singapore. And I think we have an obligation to report on the world. And I hope they take that seriously. I don't see it yet. It's very limited. And so we're still negotiating with, Western editors because the global narrative is still, to a large degree, besides Al Jazeera, shaped by the West. And it's hard because I'm trying to convince often Western editors why Congo is important. And so that was one of the first experiences in Stringer, in the first book, that kind of opened my eyes to how the press operates, how the international media operates. So I was trying to figure out how the press works, not from an intellectual place, but because I wanted to sell news. I wanted to survive in Congo, pay my rent, and earn a living. So one of my first stories was, first rejections was about, uh, there was a epidemic of rape in Congo. And so all these women were protesting in front of the UN because apparently the UN, some UN officials were alleged perpetrators of rape. Nobody had been held accountable. The UN didn't care. And so all these women were like throwing stones at the UN compound and complaining. And I called my editor at the AP and I said, you know, this is top news in Congo. And he asked me, as you can imagine, you're that guy now. He's like, anybody killed? I was like, no. Any shootings, any violence? I was like, no. He's like, nah, local baseball, not interesting. And it kind of shocked me because in the house that I was living in, the family of the accountant at Yale, I was living in their house, this was a big deal. They were talking about it every day. And I imagine your experience in Afghanistan was very similar. Like, you know, the local news or what makes the news, what's important, is just so different from what the AP felt should be world news and should be important. And if journalists, if we write the first draft of history, then what are we writing? Who are we writing it for? Who's defining this? How is it that it's so divorced from the stories told by Congolese at home? All of these were questions in my mind that, you know, I was trying to navigate. I was still trying to sell the news and give the editors at the AP what they wanted. But years later, I did a PhD on this topic. And so I did a PhD in post-colonial journalism, trying to understand, you know, these forces of racism, colonialism, classism, that prevent certain stories from being told, that value some lives more than others. You know, Judith Butler has written about this, the grievability of certain lives. And so these are the structures that still prevent many stories in the global south from getting the importance that, you know, I think they deserve. And I think if the media becomes more balanced, if India were to make a global media, Indian news media, I think they would value Bangladeshi lives and Nepali lives and, you know, Afghani lives more than Western news media would. So I think, yeah, I think it really is time to stop complaining about prejudices and biases in Western media. And I think time for global South media to start taking a more active role. And it's hard because, you know, I presented a TV show about India years ago. And we asked the news editor in Singapore, hey, can we do a similar show about America, about the US? And she was like, why don't you should do a show about Indians in the US? We were like, no, we want to do the US. She was like, how about Asian tycoons in the US? We were like, no, we just want to do the US. And she was like, no, we don't have permission. You know, we, as Asians, we can't do that. And so there was this asymmetry where Americans can come here and do books and TV shows about Asia, about China, about Southeast Asia, and we can't do that. So there's an imbalance, and I think we need to get over that in our
Mentality.
heads.
It's quite an interesting sort of moment of transformation where we are operating in. On the one hand, it is an interconnected world. The economics of the news business means a lot of sort of Western papers or news outlets that had a very narrow perspective have to open up, because if online subscriptions are not by country, it is open, then you want to see readers across the world, as they're reading the news, feel like it was written to them as well. And in my experience, I've only been with the New York Times 10 years, and I've seen the change when I first started till the end of it. At the beginning, I was reporting from Afghanistan, and then there was a habit that within the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of a story, you had to connect how this story mattered for America. You had to create that hook, and because a story was only relevant if it somehow had a connection to America. I left reporting in Afghanistan in 2020. Even by then, that had changed, simply because when we are publishing, yes, the majority of our subscribers are still Americans, but there are Brits who read it, there are Europeans who read it, there are people in India, there are people in Kenya, and it's an economic reason, but it is also the changing nature of our world, that you don't want that reader to be turned off in the second paragraph saying what is essentially a hook, but they could read it as a bias, saying this is meant for the American perspective, why should I be interested in this? So in part, that is changing, but at the same time, the structural biases have been so deeply rooted that that change will take time. But the fact that I feel at least the freshness of new perspectives in that space is getting attention, is getting time, simply because whether it's a business reason, whether it's embracing a changing world, it's a reality that people can't deny anymore.
Yeah, I think, you know, my last book was about the Central African Republic. And so when I tried to get funds for my reporting in the Central African Republic, I approached all the usual suspects, you know, the big magazines, newspapers, media organizations, and many editors asked me which Central African Republic. And I had to tell them, no, this is the name of a country. So it's like you're trying to persuade people, you have to educate people at the same time. At that time, the Central African Republic, to put it in context, had this war which was roughly of the same scale as Syria. And they had no idea what was going on in Central Africa. It was just sort of another planet. And yeah, I guess it's changing. You know, it's changing it's a small way, but I think, you know, there's so much that's deep rooted, as you say, that needs to change. It's ingrained, sort of, coming back to the Central African Republic. One of the last scenes of the book is when I'm with a friend of mine. He's American. He's a good friend. He's still a good friend. His name is Louis Mudge. He's a researcher at Human Rights Watch, and we travel through the country together. We show up at this church just as the government says it's gonna. 3,000 people are taking shelter in this church. The government shows up and says there are rebels among these 3,000 people, and the government soldiers threaten the nun. She's an Italian nun. And they say to her, if you don't get rid of these 3,000 people by tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., we're coming here and we're going to massacre everybody. And so we stay the night there, and we call these embassies, US embassy, French embassy. They all say, yeah, you know, people are being killed every day in the Central African Republic. We can't do anything. These lives don't matter. You know, we don't have any possibility to stop this killing. At midnight, Louis, my friend, calls his office, Human Rights Watch in New York. The Human Rights Watch office calls up the White House, and the White House locates our faction of the, you know, government forces. And they basically warned them. They were like, 3,000 people, whatever. If anything happens to our guy, you're toast. And the shooting is called off. In the morning, the government soldiers show up, they shoot, they fire in the air. And
This was what year?
2014.
2014,
Yeah.
okay.
And they're like, you know, nothing happens. And so we have to stay there because the US government has now ordered peacekeepers to come from the next town in armored cars to this church to protect this compound. And if we leave too soon, then the government might attack. So we have to wait for these soldiers, African Union peacekeepers, to show up and protect this compound, and then we can leave. And basically it's for one guy. And the nun, this Italian nun, she's in tears because she realizes, like a few months before, I think 160 people had been massacred in that same town, and she'd called the Pope in the Vatican. And the Pope basically told her, I can't do anything. And so even the Pope didn't have power. And there was one American dude in this town whose life basically had more power than every other lever that anybody could pull. And that kind of shows you how deep-rooted and how insidious the colonialism and sort of the weight of different lives is. 3,000 lives matters, you know, has no value against one American life. And I think to some degree that's still the case. And that underpins a lot of humanitarian work, a lot of media work. Every time, you know, foreigners or Americans or, you know, any foreign peacekeeper was attacked or killed, it was world news. If a Congolese was killed, I had to justify it to make the news. It's and a similar dynamic. You know, my editor said to me, your ideal reader is a 60-year-old white woman in the Midwest. That's what he taught me. He's like, this is how you write the news. You write the news for her. And that's how I was trained. And I guess that's changing, but in a certain way, power and what matters, which lives matter, is still governed by those kinds of equations. And so it's hard to break those.
If I mean the sort of the same anecdote that is a clear indication of the different values in lives. If you look at it from a different perspective, that say a journalist or a human rights activist was in a position of danger, the American government used its might to sort of protect them. As a way of moving to the next subject, we're actually in a reality that I am not sure that will happen anymore. Because of the way sort of mainstream media is being demonized, attacked, if we reach a moment, and this is the anxiety that I'm not American, but I still work for an American newspaper, and one sense of protection that we have in a lot of difficult places where we report that there are some red lines that the US government, as sort of protector of free press, will stand up for, and that will create some space for us to operate. But with the new government in the United States, I am not sure what the response would be for a similar call now, right? So that brings me to a situation where, to the next subject, we've got just two more things and then we'll open it up. We're both writing for what is considered sort of largely mainstream platforms in a moment where there is a perceived question of credibility. Whether it is because of the structural biases we spoke about, whether it is the overwhelming nature of attacks against them to discredit them, in that space, right, where social media platforms, where one man can decide what goes viral, right, mostly his own tweets, but one man can decide what goes viral, in that reality, when you spend months on a story for a magazine, when you spend years on a book, in that information reality, do you still have confidence that you can get through to readers?
Yeah, I guess things are changing. Chris Anderson, who founded TED, recently wrote a letter, an open letter to Elon Musk, and he called Elon Musk the most influential writer of the 21st century. So it's very based on his tweets. Okay. It's very interesting, like the definition of the writer, definition of writing, his tweets, where everything's changing. But I guess I have a question for you in this regard. Like, one of my ideas is the reason why journalists are under attack. All these accusations of fake news. One of my ideas is if journalists stopped being the gatekeepers, if somehow they gave readers access to their sources directly, to the spokesperson at Amnesty International, to whatever, the food bank in Gaza, to the kid they're writing about in Gaza, if they somehow created that access, and so the journalist said, I'm reporting the story, the value I bring is finding the story, but I'm not the gatekeeper anymore. You can directly contact them on Twitter or whatever it is. Do you think that would change the perceived trust from the reader in the journalist? Do you think they would then, they would then trust the journalist more and trust the news more because they can have direct access? They can actually ask the food bank, what do you think?
So, that would be the well-intentioned sort of counter to what they say is the mainstream media monopoly, right? That we open up this space, democratize information a lot more, and we're no longer gatekeepers. I think there's a very, very legitimate argument in that. And that has happened in the early years of social media where everybody could get their views across, views that we say would be selectively, we had a role to say what goes and what doesn't go, right? That happened. But we're talking about a different age of free-for-all social media now, right? That we've moved beyond that. And then that poses the question, yes, there's that one argument, journalist as gatekeeper, but the other argument, journalists as sifter of what is truth, what is disinformation, what is got agenda behind it, right? It is how much that role is being attacked in partisan ways that is put us in a very difficult environment. Just because we've got little time, one last question. Um, you started with what your editor had told you about your idea of who you're writing to, right? Then you changed the kind of news writing you're doing, the kind of projects you were doing, the kind of places you went to. You bring a certain background into this writing. When you, as you sit down and write today, do you have a picture of your reader in mind? Who exactly, in this world where interconnected, all these different factors that I mentioned coming into it, do you have a picture of the reader you're writing to?
I would say early on, like when I was a journalist for the AP or the first book even, I always feel like the challenge that excites me about the journalism that I'm doing is to bring stories that aren't in the mainstream to the mainstream, right? So I'm trying to convince some mainstream editor somewhere that this is important. This story is important. It could be the BBC, could be at TED, could be at the New York Times. But more and more to your point about the shifting nature of the audience, you know, even at the New York Times, who are the subscribers? For example, now in Mexico, I'm reporting, so just to give you context, I'm reporting from indigenous communities in Mexico that are fighting drone wars and other kind of wars to protect their ecosystems. These stories aren't being reported even in Mexico. So my audience now is as much international as people in Mexico City who don't know that these wars are happening. And you know, last weekend I was at a literary festival in Mexico on a panel where the Mexican reporter said, I honestly had no idea that this drone war was being fought on the west coast of Mexico, or a drone war that I had reported on. And that excites me, that she's a reporter, you know, accomplished reporter with her ear to the news in Mexico, and she didn't know about this. That's when I feel as an outsider, I'm adding value to opening up the kinds of news that is being reported in Mexico and reported internationally. And the reason why I think, you know, it matters is in Mexico, a lot of these indigenous environmental defenders, it is the most deadly country. It's one of the most deadly countries or deadliest countries in the world for environmental defenders. Many of them are indigenous. And I think as the press, if I can raise their profile in Mexico nationally or even abroad, to some degree I help protect them. It becomes more inconvenient for whoever's trying to attack them or kill them to do that. And I think that's the power of the media. We're the fourth pillar of democracy. We don't have weapons, but this is our weapon, publicity, bearing witness. And that excites me, that I can do that. And now that this Mexico City reporter, she knows, maybe it'll have a higher profile in Mexico. Maybe the people, you know, the authorities or the cartels, whoever's sanctioning or financing these wars, they'll think twice.
And I asked that question because it's a question I grapple with also. This question of who exactly am I writing to when the backgrounds we bring into these roles are a little more complicated. When I was reporting from Afghanistan, I had this question that I was experiencing the war as a citizen, but I was writing in a language where most of my countrymen didn't read, and they didn't have subscriptions to the New York Times. But I was writing to an America where it had essentially moved on. Like, they have a relationship with who they're writing to. They can feel the impact of what they're writing, right? Even if we're in a space where that impact is drowned out, the impact of journalism. So this question of who we're writing to is something that is sort of usually on my mind as well. If we could open it up to questions, I'm sure people are curious. There's some hands up there, please.
Hello, Mr. Anjan. Can you hear me? Yeah, I should admit that whatever I heard from you has really shaken me a lot. I got two questions for you. One is as a journalist, you have widely traveled in African countries and reported. What is the main reason you think is the main reason for human rights violations in many of these countries? Is it because of politics, the poverty, or the corruption, or any other reason? What do you think is the main reason for the major human rights violations in these countries? Yeah, second question is, in India I've seen that whenever something is reported by the Western media, people give a lot of value compared to the things reported by local media or media of any other country or Asian countries, or they don't, they say think that whatever is reported by the Western media is something very true or more genuine. What do you think? Why we are still having that Indian journalism or politics or politicians or common public? Why we are still having that perception? What do you think is the reason?
Tough questions, no? I'd be curious to hear what you think as well. I guess the first question, why are the human rights violations? I think a lot of the time it's because nobody's watching, or if somebody's watching, they can't do anything. And so that's something that gives me hope, actually. When I'm in a situation or a conflict or whatever and I'm reporting, just by being there, I'm making a difference. And I feel that because the perpetrators of killings or violence, often they get scared if they know someone's watching. And a lot of violence, or a lot of the worst violence that happens in situations, whether it's domestic violence inside an apartment or large-scale violence in some conflict zone. A lot of the worst violence happens in places where nobody's watching, and the perpetrators feel like they can do whatever they want. And so I think that's the power of journalism, just by showing up, looking, bearing witness, and being there, you can make a difference. So that's actually something that's heartening about the work. Even though there are lots of problems and journalism is changing, at least you can do that. Yet your second question, yeah, I think it's so many factors, but I think a big one or an interesting factor is still colonialism, right? Like there's still a sense that even books or the news has, there's still a sense that, for us to read credible news, say about, I don't know about, your bureau now, but at least when I was in Cambodia, I lived in Cambodia before Mexico for 5 years. A lot of the news about Cambodia would go to London or New York to The Guardian or the New York Times, and then it would come to a reader in India. But India and Cambodia have historic ties that go back centuries, millennia. And somehow there isn't that connection, or it isn't perceived as important for Indian news to report on Cambodia directly, or for Cambodian news to report on India directly. They still rely on Western news to serve as a kind of relay. And that means probably there's some Western editor who's serving as a filter for what is important about each of these countries to each other. It's crazy. It shouldn't be this way. But we just don't, I don't know why in India there's not a sense that we need to give our own stories more importance and our region more importance. But I don't know, as a South Asia bureau chief, do you see that? Or do you see?
I think just to add to that, in addition to the sort of structural issues that you mentioned, is the political reality here as well, where I'm sure the issues that we write about, and then it gets talked about as the Western media wrote, the experienced senior journalists in India know those issues in much more detail than we do. But there is a degree of self-censorship that happens because of the political pressures here. To cite a Western outlet gives a degree of distance. And that's not unique to India, that happens in other places as well. So that's a factor as well. We are not first on any of this stuff. It takes us much longer to learn about these issues, and we barely scratch the surface. But then when it gets talked about, the reference becomes the New York Times or the Washington Post. And when I look at it, I think one reason is this also, that citing doesn't necessarily give credibility, but citing these outside outlets creates a little distance in the face of the very real political pressures.
So I would love to know about your view on Afghanistan cricket team, because I've been following the team for like the last 10 years and the growth has been tremendous. And I believe that it has liberated a lot of people to follow their dreams, right? From like every class in Afghanistan, I believe. And I would like to know your view on that. I have another question to both of you. Going forward, AI tools are going to be like, you cannot avoid them. But how are you planning to integrate them into your workflow? Let's say you have a report, you have a news,
Integrate what into the workflow?
AI into
AI
your
tools.
workflow.
Okay, okay. So
Yeah.
I will take the AI one. You talk about the Afghanistan cricket. Um, so absolutely, I mean the Afghanistan cricket team is a reason for joy in a place that is facing a deeply oppressive reality. If there's one happy thing that is coming out of Afghanistan, it is that. But you've probably followed the debate also right now. There are calls for boycotting the men's team because of what is happening, the gender apartheid in Afghanistan. This argument, I think it's a little more complicated, that the men don't necessarily, in the political reality of Afghanistan, we shouldn't deprive that country of the one little joy they have. But I do think we should do away with this sense of normalization where around the world this Afghanistan team travels, everybody thinks they present a country that is normal because here are these young athletic men jumping around, celebrating, making great money, right? Everywhere they go, I think we should remind people that half of our country are deprived of the most basic rights. Sport is great, we should all celebrate sport, but there are more fundamental things that people are deprived of. So I would like to see that anywhere the Afghanistan men's cricket team plays, they're celebrities, they get great attention on the world stage, but I would like to see every opportunity where they play also be a reminder that they represent a country where half of our population are not getting their most basic human rights.
And AI, I guess, I plan to write about it. I plan to write about sort of how I see mathematics is transforming the world. What I mentioned earlier, I feel like it's abstracting nature, abstracting our bodies. I'd like to write about that. I'd like to write sci-fi. No matter what genre I'm working in, I still see myself as a reporter. And so whether I'm reporting on Congo or Mexico or mathematics, I think the process is still similar. I think it's rooted, the writing, for me at least, is rooted in lived experience. And so the experience of studying and exploring mathematics will inform the writing that I do on that topic. But yeah, I guess that's the most direct way in which I see myself as engaging with those kinds of topics.
In terms of our workflow and the use of AI, just if I can add a little bit, the New York Times, I think the closest that I've seen our platforms use it, they're experimenting and using it in translation, I think, in terms of making sure our content could be available in other languages. But I do think our approach to use, as far as I am aware, I think has been more cautious, including that we are in some legal suit, I think, about how our content is being used by AI. So all of that tells me that our approach is a little more cautious on it. There's a question there.
Hey guys, thanks. As an education journalist turned academic, so one of the things I deal with, grapple with often is this dilemma of urgency, which I suppose journalism and reportage gives versus academia, which slow cooks its conclusions. So I suppose as an academic and as a journalist, how do you grapple with the sense of urgency and the timeliness of what you have to do?
Yes. This is a question I had for him also, I forgot, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question.
You take 2 years to write a book, when the demand is so urgent and in an age where people want things instantly? How do you cope with this?
I don't know. I like to take my time. I think taking my time produces. I mean, fewer people are reading today. I think. I don't know the statistics, but it feels like that. I think my responses to that sense of changing readership or two. The reason I still write is because I think writing, unlike other media, has longevity, can last a long time. So if you write something well, you spend a lot of time thinking about it, you craft it well, there's a chance that it could be read years, decades, whatever, longer from now. And that's something I think, you know, with other media forms, it doesn't quite have that. You know, visual standards change. Yeah, other media just seem more ephemeral. And so why still write? I think that's a reason. There's a sense of legacy that writing offers. That said, I think writing also has, you know, shrinking audiences, especially among younger generations. That's just a reality. So I think more and more, and that's my second response, I think writing is a raw material. I see writing as a raw material for other forms of media. While the writing can last a long time, if you want to touch a lot of people now, then you have to transform it into visual media, into other forms, and that's more immediate. And so I'm playing with some ideas like transforming my journalism into visual art. I have a project that's, you know, a museum has commissioned. I'm excited about, I just finished a book that's reportage, that's writing, but it's written as a poem. It's a book-length poem, so it's verse. It's 140 pages, so it's, which is easier to read. It's more inspired by spoken word. It's easier to access, I think. It's quicker. So I'm interested in all these, you know, different ways of transforming writing into more immediate, more accessible, more quicker, more widely consumed forms of media. So those are the two ways in which I'm thinking about it. Yeah, I don't think I'd be satisfied producing. I was an AP kind of news. I was an AP stringer in Congo, and that was daily news, and it was great training, but I just wasn't satisfied. I don't know. Yeah.
Just to add to that, my heart also is in sort of taking my time with a story. And I came from a magazine background as well, so I would like to see a story develop. But my job demands of me to produce something within the news cycle to remain relevant. But I do think after this initial flood of the rush to be quick and to produce things in the immediate, there's a role for that as well. But because there's so much of that, there is the day after also falls within the news cycle of, okay, I've woken up this morning and I've seen a flood of information. I'm overwhelmed. Who is going to help make sense of this for me in the next day or next week, right? And so I see that falling within the news cycle as well. So the itch that I get to squeeze something in that initial flood of information, that I tell myself that actually there's a role to play in the days following as well, and that is still counted within the news cycle. So that's how I mitigate.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.